I will explain the process from the Russo-Japanese War to the Pacific War. In this issue, I will explain the Nomonhan Incident. The Nomonhan Incident was a military conflict that resulted from a border dispute between Manchukuo, the Soviet Union, and Mongolia. This was an important battle that changed Japan's subsequent war strategy. In my previous commentary, I introduced the first half of the second Nomonhan Incident. This time, the second half will be explained. The Japanese army tried to conduct an operation to surround and destroy the Soviet forces by committing their few precious tank units from July 2, 1939. However, they were attacked by Soviet armored forces beyond their expectations and retreated on July 5. The retreating infantry unit led by Major General Kobayashi received orders to attack Soviet positions on the east bank of the Kalka River with the support of tank and artillery units. However, on the 5th, the Tank Corps was attacked by Soviet armored forces and was ordered to retreat by the Kwantung Army. They could not afford to have their precious Tank Corps wiped out. Kobayashi's unit was to face the Soviet armored forces with only infantry. The division commander, Komatsubara, then came up with a plan. It was to conduct night raids where enemy tanks could not be used, defend positions during the day to avoid fire, and repeat the night raids again. They would then entice the enemy to wear them down, destroy the bridges over the Kalka River, and cut off the enemy's supply routes. The massive night attack by Japanese forces that began on July 7 was completely unexpected by the Soviets. The Soviets withdrew without checking their surroundings. They also engaged in numerous friendly fights in the darkness, and the Soviet forces were on the verge of collapse. Hearing this news, Zhukov immediately dispatched reinforcements. However, this was a novice unit with little military experience. As soon as they arrived at the battle site on July 10, they panicked and retreated. Upon learning of this retreat, Zhukov immediately convened a court-martial and mercilessly executed them by firing squad. The Soviets mercilessly shot those who took the initiative in retreating, but they repeatedly retreated when the Japanese conducted night raids. In parallel with the night raids, the Japanese also blew up Soviet bridges across the Kalka River. They then blew up 2 bridges. However, the Soviets had 9 bridges, and at the end of the Nomonhan Incident, they had 28 bridges. The Japanese, on the other hand, could only build 1 bridge. And it was a bridge that tanks could not pass through. This shows how much the Japanese underestimated the strength of the enemy forces. On July 11, an infantry unit from Yamagata, which had served as the mainstay of the first Nomonhan Incident, conducted a massive night raid. During this night raid, the Soviet troops who had been attacked at night withdrew without warning, and the brigade commander of the Tank Corps at the back of the raid was killed in action. In addition, a company of Yamagata's troops that went too deep into the hole were surrounded by Soviet troops and were annihilated in the hole. The Mongolians called this hole the Tomb of the Samurai. The Japanese night raids inflicted confusion and heavy losses on the Soviet forces. However, there were also 2,122 Japanese casualties, a casualty rate of 23%. In the end, the strategy of attacking at night and returning to positions during the daytime did not significantly take enemy positions. This result was not satisfactory for the Kwantung Army. The Kwantung Army, believing it necessary to exclude Soviet artillery, combined Japanese reinforcements with whatever artillery was available in Manchuria to form an artillery corps. This artillery corps had 82 pieces of heavy artillery and field artillery. The Japanese army had never deployed artillery of this size in a single battle. Major General Uchiyama, who commanded the artillery group, said, "In 3 hours, the Soviet artillery would be beaten to death and our targets would be dead." However, there were no more than 30,000 shells, and there was no way to replenish the supply. Rear Admiral Uchiyama was bullish because he was overconfident in the strength of his own troops and judged the number of enemy heavy guns to be 76. He believed that if the numbers were even, the elite Japanese forces would have the advantage. In reality, however, The Soviets had more than twice as many heavy artillery pieces as the Japanese and more than enough shells. The artillery corps began bombardment in support of a general attack on the Japanese forces on July 23. The Japanese artillery often rejoiced that they had destroyed the enemy batteries because the Japanese bombardment often stopped the Soviet fire, but in reality the Soviet artillery merely changed their firing positions. The Soviet artillery fire continued unabated, and Japanese infantrymen were barely able to advance. The Soviet artillery positions were located in poor visibility from the Japanese observation posts, and the Japanese artillery fire was not very accurate. Therefore, an attempt was made to use balloons for observation, but as soon as the balloons were raised, they were shot down by Soviet fighter planes. This was witnessed by infantrymen all over the battlefield and was very demoralizing for them. Nevertheless, the Japanese had inflicted a fair amount of damage during the Nomonhan Incident, destroying 36 pieces of heavy artillery. However, it was the Soviets who efficiently used their artillery, which they concentrated on the Japanese infantry units and succeeded in frustrating the Japanese offensive. 3 days later, on the 25th, the Japanese artillery corps ran out of ammunition and was silenced. Conversely, Soviet artillery fire continued to increase, and Division Commander Komatsubara expressed his disappointment that our artillery was completely useless. The Japanese had suffered 4,400 casualties by July 25 and needed to replenish their forces quickly. The Soviet forces, on the other hand, were reported to have suffered more than 7,000 casualties, and reinforcements were arriving one after another. The Kwantung Army judged that it was impossible for Komatsubara's division to mount a major offensive and ordered it to build a position and take a defensive posture. Tsuji also led this order. He believed that the Mongolian winter can reach 51 degrees below zero, and under such conditions, an offensive operation would result in the freezing to death of the soldiers. It was a common-sense decision to retreat to the command post, where enemy shells could not reach, and to house the soldiers in barracks with cold-resistant facilities. However, Tsuji had no intention of retreating his troops as it was absolutely necessary to secure the territory taken. Building positions on the front line was extremely difficult, and only about one-third of the work was completed by the time the general attack by the Soviet forces began. On August 4, the Kwantung Army created a new army, the 6th Army, and attempted to dispatch it to Nomonhan. They tried to apply the 7th Division of the Kwantung Army to the main force of the 6th Army, but Tsuji refused, saying that the 7th Division, which was the strategic reserve of the Kwantung Army, could not be used lightly. In the end, the 6th Army simply became the upper echelon of the 23rd Division in Komatsubara, and nothing was done to replenish its strength. The commander of this 6th Army was Lieutenant General Ogisu. The general staff led by Ogisu was not involved in the Battle of Nomonhan at all and was not familiar with the war situation. At a strategy meeting on the 13th, Ogisu ordered that if the enemy attempted to enter our position, we would move in, surround them, and attack. He ordered that the units be positioned vertically and deeply. It was impossible from the beginning for the 6th Army, which in reality had only the strength of a division, to deploy vertically in Nomonhan, which stretched 37 kilometers. Upon hearing this order, Komatsubara grew increasingly distrustful of Lieutenant General Ogisu. Ogisu and his staff of the 6th Army placed the headquarters of the 6th Army in Hyrule, 200 kilometers from Nomonhan, because they did not even have their own guards. As a result, during the general attack by the Soviets, there was not a single military chief of staff at the front line. Zhukov ridiculed him, saying that the Japanese military leaders were taking leave and playing in the rear. At that time, the Soviets were preparing to launch a major offensive against the Japanese. A new commander, General Gregory Stern Second Class, was dispatched as commander of the frontline forces. This meant that Zhukov was under Stern's command, but Zhukov was given the authority to lead independently in the operation. The Moscow command expected Stern to play a logistical role, but Stern wanted to intervene in the operation, which Zhukov refused to do. The discrepancy between the two sides became acute in the critical phase of the battle. Moscow's command sent large numbers of troops and supplies to Nomonhan, with 30,000 troops and reinforcements alone. The Soviets took 3 weeks to prepare a general offensive and used deception to ensure that their intentions were not noticed. They repeatedly attacked the Japanese forces, which were building positions, with artillery fire in small units. The attacks, however, were severe, and the Japanese forces responded valiantly, inflicting heavy losses on the Soviet forces in both attacks. The command post at Komatsubara had become so accustomed to the daily offensives that it failed to be alert for the large movements of the Soviet forces and overlooked the enemy's repositioning. Komatsubara failed to see through the Soviet deception and did not react to reports from the front lines that there were signs of a major enemy offensive. In the early morning of August 20th, Soviet artillery bombardment began, and the advance of ground troops on the front line began. The Soviet strategy was for the infantry in the center to attack the Japanese in the front while armored units on both flanks bypassed the Japanese and completely surrounded them. The Japanese 6th Army had 1 infantry division, while the Soviets had 4 infantry divisions, 2 cavalry divisions, 7 tank brigades, and 3 artillery divisions. The Soviet forces were overwhelmingly strong, with a total of 52,000 troops, 438 tanks, 385 armored vehicles, and 292 field guns. The difference in troop strength was more than 3 times that of the Soviets, more than 4 times that of the Japanese artillery, and 0 for the Japanese when it came to tanks. Even when the Soviets began their massive offensive with this great power, the Japanese did not go on the defensive, but tried to conduct a reversal offensive. Even after seeing this massive offensive, the Japanese military command still misjudged the enemy's strength. In the Nomonhan Incident, both armies made operational mistakes due to insufficient reconnaissance activities and misinformation about each other. Zhukov overestimated the strength of the Japanese forces by more than 50,000 men, more than 3 times the actual number. Based on that overestimate, careful planning of the operation did not seriously impede the overall operation. On the 20th, Zhukov ordered an attack on the Japanese forces defending the Hui Highlands. This was to be defended by a force of 800 men led by Lieutenant Colonel Aoki. Here Zhukov deployed 6,000 infantrymen, 200 tanks, and 123 armored vehicles in an attempt to seize the Hui Highlands. Lieutenant Colonel Aoki skillfully fortified the highlands and with 800 men and a few guns, repulsed the Soviets. When Zhukov learned that the 20th attack had failed to break through the Hui Highlands despite heavy losses, he decided to devote all of his reserve forces to an attack on the Hui Highlands. However, his superior officer, Stern, opposed this. However, Zhukov insisted on an early settlement, claiming that postponing the operation would cause even more damage. In the end, Zhukov pushed his point. This incident deepened the conflict between the two sides. Lieutenant Colonel Aoki's unit held off the overwhelming Soviet attack on the 21st and 22nd. Aoki's fighting was so robust that even Zhukov recognized it, but by the 24th he had suffered 360 casualties out of 800 men, and had run out of food and ammunition. His men said that we would not last half a day if we remained here, and advised Aoki to retreat. Aoki, out of a sense of responsibility, tried to commit suicide with a pistol, but his men stopped him and begged him to give the order to retreat. On the 24th, Aoki gave the order to retreat on his own initiative, an unprecedented move for the Japanese army. The remaining 269 soldiers miraculously escaped the Soviet encirclement and retreated to Mount Opone. Aoki was an excellent commander, who had stalled the Soviet forces and inflicted heavy losses on them. If Zhukov had been in command, he would have awarded Aoki a Medal of Honor. However, Ogisu and Komatsubara did not forgive Aoki for withdrawing without permission. He committed suicide on September 16 after the ceasefire in Nomonhan. The Great Soviet Offensive has only just begun, but it's getting long, so I'll leave the rest for the next commentary. If you enjoyed it, Please subscribe to our channel and click the like button.